Gower Peninsula in South Wales, there's a spectacular landscape of cliffs and caves. In 1823, in one of these caves, a skeleton was found, surrounded by beautiful artifacts of ivory and shell. It turned out to be a young man who died around 29,000 years ago. What's remarkable is that his burial can give us a glimpse of a world that existed before the height of the Ice Age. Just a few thousand years after his death, ice sheets would spread south across Britain. I've come to unravel the mystery of the lost world in which this man lived. I wanted to find out how the country would have looked here 29,000 years ago when the young man's body was buried in the cave.
It's easy to forget that all the surface landscape we see in the country, the seashore, grasslands, forests, all has developed over the last 10,000 years since the great ice sheet retreated. But before the ice advanced, there was another Britain, where people lived in a landscape that has long since vanished, obliterated by the ice. So what was it like?
The first thing was to explore the cave where the young man was found, at Paviland as it's now called. But it's not easy to get into. Before the ice, 29,000 years ago, the sea would have been about 70 miles away from here. Since then, as the ice sheets melted, the sea has risen about 120 meters. When the young man was buried, this was probably a relatively easy climb up a ski slope. Now that's been washed away by the sea, and even getting here is an achievement.
Most astonishing place. For me, all caves have a mysterious atmosphere, a strange sculpturing of the wall, and this cave in particular, when I think that this is the exact place where the body of that young man laid for 29,000 years. And one reflects on the people who were with him, his companions. They brought his body in, laid him there, and left him. The view from here must have been amazing. 29,000 years ago, they could have surveyed a flat plain stretching for miles. And the cave too must have been visible from far away, a striking point of reference in the landscape. It must have been a significant sight for them. But what can this burial tell us about life back then? I need to go to Oxford, where the remains of the young man's body are now kept.
It was geologist William Buckland who first examined the bones back in 1823. He labelled them as female and was struck by their covering of red ochre, what he called ruddle. He brought them to Oxford, and there in the Natural History Museum, archaeologist Paul Pettit showed them to me.
So here she lies, the Red Lady of Paviland, Buckland called her.
The Red Lady himself, yes. Buckland did speculate that it was male, and in fact we now know definitely that the Red Lady was a young adult male.
And here's this ruddle that Buckland describes. It's very striking on these bones here, isn't it?
It's extremely striking on all of the bones of the lower body from the pelvis downwards.
It strikes me how must have been a pretty tall individual.
If he was, we can estimate his stature from the size of his femur, his thigh bone, and he probably stood about 5'10" tall in life. So he was a tall, long-legged, long-armed member of our own species.
Very different from the short, stocky Neanderthals.
Yes, quite different.
The more heavily built Neanderthals are known to have survived until around this time. But although this man's skull and some other bones are gone, probably washed away by the sea, there's enough to confirm that the skeleton from Paviland belonged to someone quite different. He's the first known modern human in Britain. And the beautifully crafted flint spearheads found nearby tell us he was a hunter. But there was something else in the cave.
Buckland mentions that there was a mammoth skull at the head of the skeleton.
He does. We have the Red Lady in the nice central position here, and in very close proximity this complete skull with tusk fragments attached to it as well.
So, all you're saying indicates that this must have been a very exceptional burial of an exceptional person.
Absolutely. And these are fragments of rods of mammoth ivory, which have been polished with red ochre, perhaps magic wands.
Wands, mammoth ivory.
Yes, clearly magical items, because they come from these tremendous, large, dangerous and probably quite rare animals. He's probably special in a spiritual sense, perhaps a medicine man, someone who could intercede with the spirit world and was important to his society because of that.
The sacred burial of a young man, one of the new breed of humans, different from the Neanderthals, and certainly very different from the Red Lady William Buckland had imagined. Down here on the beach at the Mumbles, you can still find what geologists think is the source of their ochre. If you take bits of this rock and grind it up with water or oil, you can get the kind of dye that they would have used for the burial. These people had strong beliefs and elaborate rituals. It looks like a complex and well-organized community. It's our first glimpse into that lost world before the ice. But what was life like for these people 29,000 years ago?
I wanted to start by finding out about the climate. I know that sometimes a record of climate changes going back long into the past can be preserved in caves. 3 miles from Paviland, where the remains of the young man were found, is Cathole Cave. There I met geographer Pete Smart from Bristol University, who invited me to join him on a hunt for stalagmites.
You can see the stalagmite at the top quite nicely here.
This curtain stuff, yes.
That's right, you see it's running down into the stalagmite overlying this other material underneath.
Pete explained that stalagmites and stalactites only grow during warmer climate spells. I wanted to know why.
2 reasons. First of all, when the ground's frozen at the surface, you're not going to get any water coming down into the cave. And secondly, when it's cold, there's not enough biological activity and you just simply don't get the carbonic acid to dissolve the limestone and deposit the stalagmites.
More plants growing, yes.
That's absolutely it,
yeah.
Because the growth of these cave formations depends on climate, they contain a climate record going back thousands of years. Pete's been examining samples from caves in the area.
First thing we do when we get these back is we cut them so we can see the internal structure. And you can see in this one there are a whole series of different layers, and it's accumulated slowly through time.
So this is stop and start, is it really, these lines on here?
That's right. and they each reflect climate conditions. Climate was warm, and then it cooled down, the stalagmite stopped growing, it switched back on again when conditions became warm, and so forth.
Now, you can get some dating from this.
That's right. The key thing is that we can tell the ages when these changes in climate occurred, because the sample has in it uranium. The uranium decays over time, and we can get the age of these changes of climate from that.
So what do these measurements tell us about the climate 29,000 years ago when the young man was buried in Paviland?
What we know is there was no stalagmite deposition at that time in any of the Gower caves. The last phase of stalagmite deposition we've got is at about 35,000 years. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing a change from relatively warm conditions at 35,000 years ago through towards colder and colder conditions with the accumulation of ice sometime through to a maximum at about 20,000 years.
So at the time of the young man's burial, the climate was getting colder.
It was getting colder. It must have been harder and harder to survive in this environment.
So the stalagmites in these caves show that when the young man was buried, it was getting significantly colder. The ice was on its way. Within a few thousand years of the young man's burial, the whole area to the north of the cave was under hundreds of meters of ice. So I wonder what the landscape was like here 29,000 years ago. What evidence might there be about the temperatures and vegetation in Britain before the ice? At the University of Birmingham, paleobiologist Russell Coop is trying to identify the remains of insects which he finds in sediments from around the country. I went to find out what this reveals.
So what sort of insects were living in Britain 29,000 years ago?
Well, most of the bits that occur as fossils are beetles, because they've got such a robust skeleton, they just survive. And other insects are a bit more frail, like flies and things like that, so they don't survive very well. And what I've got here is mostly bits of beetles. You can see here that they're really rather spectacular and beautiful things.
Yes. Now you can match those up with living species today. You can identify them.
Yes.
Remarkably, all the insects he finds in the sediments are recognizable as modern species, but many of them are species adapted to cold climates and no longer occur in Britain.
One of the most curious of them all, of course, is the fact that I have a dung beetle that's only found now in Tibet. And yet, at 29,000 years ago, it was by far the way our commonest dung beetle.
It took an expert like Russell to identify the fossil remains of the Tibetan dung beetle.
Can you see that there?
Yet this tiny creature, now found only high on the Tibetan plateau, gives us the clearest indication of what the climate was like in Britain when the young man was living at Paviland.
What does this tell us about the climate?
It suggests that the climate then, i.e. 29,000 years ago, was something like the Arctic Siberian climate of present time. Summer temperatures were about 10 degrees. That's something equivalent to midwinter at present time. That's the warmest month is like the coldest month now. But winter temperatures were minus 20 degrees as an average.
What would the vegetation have been like?
We can imagine a landscape totally without trees and with very, very small amounts of vegetation. Dwarf willows would be about this high, and dwarf birches about that high, and that's about as big a tree as you'll get.
Now I can begin to imagine what this landscape would have looked like 29,000 years ago. Certainly nothing like we see today.
The sea was 70 miles away. Here there was just a vast expanse of tundra. A few small trees, low bushes, some grasses. So how did the people of Paviland manage to survive with so little vegetation? Well, we know they were hunters. So what were they hunting? What animals lived in this landscape? Just as the Goa Peninsula caves have preserved human remains and clues to the climate thousands of years ago, I discovered they also hold a unique record of the animals that were alive at this time. At Baconhole Cave, I joined Andy Currant, curator of Ice Age mammals at the Natural History Museum in London. He's been excavating here for the last 30 years, searching for fragments of animal bones. The bones he's found preserved in the sediments reveal what was living here.
Wonderful place to do some field work in good weather anyway.
Yes, they've been digging in the back of the cave since the 1850s. Let's go and have a look.
And you're still making new discoveries.
We've really only tickled the surface of this site, and there are still bits of the cave we know very little about at all.
Long before Andy started work here, animal bones had been found in the caves, which he describes as natural dustbins. Some of the finds even go back to Victorian times.
So that's where the Victorians were excavating
Yes.
150 years ago.
Yeah, they dug quite a big hole there, and they found an awful lot of material there as well. But it's in the dark, right at the back of the cave.
The finds show us which animals lived here as the climate grew cool. Back at the Natural History Museum in London, Andy showed me what's been found over the years.
Oh, that's great.
Come on. There we go.
That is a most marvellous skull. Now, this is Paviland period, but not from Paviland.
Yep, it's a mammoth. It's actually from the Old Kent Road. Don't tell anybody.
Mammoth in the Old Kent Road, I like it.
There's only part of the skull here. The forward part of it's all been broken away.
And these are the great teeth.
Yep, they're the upper teeth. The tongue would have been in here, and the tusks would have been going down into the table.
And, yes, huge tusks.
Massive tusks.
Buckland found the skeleton with a mammoth at the head, I think.
Yes.
Mammoth skull.
Mammoth skull at the head.
Mammoths were wandering around in this part of Europe.
They were certainly around in the landscape. They were coming across from northern Europe, across a dry North Sea into Britain.
What other animals were around in the Paviland region at that time?
The constant companion of the woolly mammoth is the woolly rhinoceros, is the upper tooth of a woolly rhino.
That must have been a huge animal also.
That's a big animal. It weighs about 1.5 tons. Reindeer, lovely little reindeer antler.
Right.
They really are a cold climate animal. And here's a lower tooth of a horse. And there's a very strong association between humans and horses throughout the record. And here's a lovely little jaw of the spotted hyena.
Real bone-crushing teeth. Yeah.
That's a bone eater.
Andy's research allows us to picture the animals which lived in the tundra landscape of Britain before the ice finally arrived. The people of Paviland must have hunted some of these animals for food. But is there any way of telling more precisely what was in their diet?
Andy's work forms part of a unique collaboration between scientists. Over the next 5 years here at the Natural History Museum, they're going to be putting together the most complete record so far of early Britons, the Ancient Human Occupation of Britain project. One of the things they hope to find out is what these early people ate. And in that, the young man buried in the cave at Paviland has a vital role to play.
I went to see Mike Richards, a bioarchaeologist at Bradford University.
Glasses on.
A Amazingly, by analysing minute quantities of human and Neanderthal bones, he's able to tell what they ate 29,000 years ago. He's trying to get an overall picture of how their diets compared.
One of the most interesting comparisons we've been doing is looking at the Red Lady, which is one of the first modern humans in Europe, with the last Neanderthals in Europe as well, to see how they compare, because they're living in the same environments, and were they doing the same things in terms of diet, or were they doing very different things?
Mike's work is breaking new ground. He's also looking at the results from animals whose diets are known, and this allows him to pin down for the first time what Neanderthals and early humans were eating.
These remains are very rare, and it's only in the last few years that we've been able to get our methods right, so we can take very, very small samples to do this kind of analysis.
Yes, it's precious stuff. And what technique do you use here? What are you getting at?
We're trying to look at the past diet by looking at the protein in the bone. So what we've done is we've got the drilled bone here, and now I add some hydrochloric acid to it. And that should dissolve away most of the bone mineral. And after a day or two, what'll be left is the collagen, the protein part of the bone. Sort of 10 or 20% of the bone will be left in the bottom, and that's the material we want. After a few days of that, we get this sort of very nice, fluffy collagen. And from that, we measure the carbon and nitrogen isotopes. And these are chemical signatures that will tell us about what protein he would have eaten over his lifetime.
We are what we eat.
We are what we eat, exactly, indeed.
So by measuring the amounts of carbon and nitrogen in the protein of ancient bones, Mike can get a clear picture of what people ate during their lifetime. He plots his results graphically, which allows him to compare humans and Neanderthals with different animals, including known plant eaters and meat eaters.
And how do Neanderthals come out on this?
Well, as you can see, the Neanderthals plot up here with the meat eaters. So our conclusion from this is the Neanderthals are getting all of their protein from meat. They're hunting, they're 100% meat eaters.
And where would the Red Lady have plotted on this?
Well, the Red Lady is quite different, actually, if you see here.
The diet of the Red Lady compares closely with animals like the bear, which suggests that as much as 15 or 20% of the protein was fish or other seafood. The diet of the first modern humans, then, was quite different from Neanderthals.
And I suppose this might have given them an edge when times got hard, because after all the ice was advancing, and if they had this versatility, it might have given them some advantage over the Neanderthals.
I think that's what we're seeing. I think Neanderthals, even with changing climate, seem to still be doing the same thing dietarily, whereas modern humans, what we've seen from this evidence is they can be more creative. They can find other sources of food.
29,000 years ago, the sea was about 70 miles west of the Gower Peninsula. For a diet rich in seafood, the people of Paviland must have travelled.
So Mike's discoveries suggest that these people must have spent quite a bit of time by the sea. They must have been part nomadic. They would come to places like this to search out other sources of food. Shellfish, for example. It seems they were more versatile and creative in their diet than the Neanderthals. Indeed, some archaeologists believe that this is why the Neanderthals died out, because they had no alternative to meat when the large animals became scarce.
But I wonder just how far the nomadic people of Paviland would have travelled. At that time, the Gower Peninsula was still part of mainland Europe. How much were these people part of a wider community? Paul Pettit took me to Three Cliffs Bay, just along the coast from the cave at Paviland.
we have a number of examples of similarity in behaviour that indicate that these people are coming into regular contact with each other. In particular, burials, which we find across Europe, right to the east of Moscow, in fact.
Like the Paviland burial?
Exactly, share a number of similarities with the Red Lady that can't be coincidental.
So 29,000 years ago, when Europe was one large landmass, it seems similar people lived right across the continent, from the cave at Paviland to Siberia. Their patterns of burial are strikingly alike. The remains are covered in red ochre. Usually there is mammoth ivory jewellery and elaborate shell decorations. They're buried with the bones of large and dangerous herbivores like mammoths. And they have flint spearheads and stone tools beside them. But there's something else. Evidence from these other sites can fill in missing pieces of the mystery of Britain before the ice. As the climate got colder, what did these nomadic people do for shelter? Experimental archaeologist Jackie Wood has been investigating and trying out some of the techniques she's uncovered.
Well, you've constructed this lovely little house here, and this is how they would have done it.
Well, yes, there is actually evidence for this type of structure from post holes that are found from the period. Sometimes a lot larger than this, but actually this size is also typical as well. Sort of a temporary sort of shelter it would have been.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty commodious, really.
Yeah.
Quite good in here. Keeps the wind off.
Big enough to spend a few nights in, maybe, hunting?
Sure. I suppose they would have had trouble finding large timber. Not much of it around.
In some areas in sheltered valleys there would be dwarf birch, which they could make this sort of structure with, but in other areas where it's more tundra, they would have hunt mammoth, and the mammoth bones would be used for the house structures.
It's good shelter. It's also pretty mobile. I mean, they could have up sticks literally and moved along,
and they just carry the skins with them, because obviously the skins are useful, sort of a canvas of that period.
Yes.
And there have been other discoveries.
This is some winkles that we've cooked sort of using hot stones from the fire and seaweed, and they've cooked just in the water with the hot stones in it.
And the seaweed makes this little
lovely flavour.
Because I suppose hot food would have been very important.
Oh, absolutely. On a cold climate, hot food's really important.
European sites reveal evidence not just of shelters, but also sophisticated stone tools. And there are traces of basketry and textiles, and beautiful jewellery. So finally, the picture of this lost world which we put together can include a sense of the human communities who lived here. There may have been clusters of huts in the lee of a hillside, huddled close together against the cold of the tundra landscape. And the people of Paviland had clearly developed many skills. I asked Paul how important this was to understanding their communities.
I think when we've arrived at a situation in which people who are very skilled at certain tasks come together and share those skills, then quite clearly this group is going to be able to exploit the landscape and its resources in a far more effective way. And I think a number of very important social phenomena will follow on from this. They may be able to sit on the same spot of the landscape for longer, get to know it more intimately, live in larger numbers, albeit for, only part of the year. More communication will occur, and perhaps more social innovations and so on.
As they travelled, these people worked together and depended on each other, and so were better able to exploit the landscape as the ice approached. Paul believes that the harsh conditions in which they lived may well have helped to shape the society which resulted.
If we put all the evidence together, a picture emerges of a quite complex and mobile society, perhaps the first society of modern humans that Britain and the rest of Europe had ever known. But of course in Britain it couldn't last. As the ice sheets advanced, the people of Paviland must have retreated south across Europe and left Britain uninhabited for almost 10,000 years. But still, the remarkable evidence from the caves in the Gower, and in particular that burial of the young man at Paviland, have given us a glimpse of Britain cold and rather bleak, where our ancestors once lived.